last 12 weeks we have been focusing our thoughts on the way of Jesus. Essentially, we have been asking ourselves what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And over the weeks we've discovered that being a follower of Jesus isn't just about believing certain truths or merely attending a place of worship, but it's a whole new way of living. Several weeks ago I shared with you that great quote from the author of the message, Eugene Peterson. He said, "The Jesus way, wedded to the Jesus truth, brings about the Jesus life." Peterson continues, "We can't proclaim the Jesus truth, but then do it in any old way we like. Nor can we follow the Jesus way without speaking the Jesus truth." And right at the heart of this series, we have asked ourselves, what is the Jesus way? What do we learn from the life of Jesus that provides a guide to our lives in Tamworth in 2022? In which way is his teaching applicable to our times? And as I was thinking about this again this week, I was drawn to some well-known verses in Matthew chapter 11. Matthew chapter 11 verse 28. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." I find this a fascinating self-description of Jesus. He speaks of himself as gentle and humble in heart. Now, humility is one of those strange characteristics. That is, once you recognize you have it, you've lost it. Unless, of course, you're Jesus. In the Old Testament book of Numbers, we read in chapter 12, verse 3, "Now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth." Who on earth wrote those words? Well, Numbers is one of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, often referred to as the books of Moses. So, as many believe, Moses wrote it. Humility, once you know you've got it, you've lost it. Actually, to be fair to Moses, I think that verse was a later addition to the text by a scribe. Now, if you were reading the Gospels for the very first time, you might struggle over Jesus describing himself as gentle too. For we read of the time when Jesus made a whip and drove money changers out of the temple courts, with sheep and cattle being scattered and tables and coins being overturned. Absolute mayhem. Then there were other occasions too when Jesus appeared to be anything but gentle, such as the time that he described the religious leaders as being like whitewashed tombs and a brood of vipers. Now, if you think that being gentle means being weak, insipid, wishy-washy, colourless, bland, tame, then I think you've got the wrong guy. Being gentle in reference to Jesus doesn't mean being genteel. So what does it mean then? Well, we'll come to that in a moment. But if you take a text out of context, all you're left with is a con. So our first question is, what is Jesus referring to when he says that he is gentle and humble in heart? And who, by the way, are the weary and burdened that he refers to? And what is Jesus referring to when he invites people to take his yoke upon them? For, as he says, "My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Well, literally, as most of us know, a yoke is a wooden beam that rested on the shoulders of oxen hitched to a plough and is used to evenly distribute the burden of work between the two animals. But Jesus was using this language of a yoke in a more metaphorical way. Let me explain. In Jesus' day, as in our day, many people had difficulty understanding and applying the scriptures. This difficulty is perhaps best highlighted in the ways that people in Jesus' day interpreted the laws of the Sabbath. Now, in the Torah, which is the Jewish name for the first 5 books of the Bible, also referred to as the Law or the Pentateuch or the books of Moses, there was a command which stated, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy." Now, immediately following that verse, we are told that the people were not to work on the Sabbath day because God rested on the Sabbath after creating the world. But here's the problem. Who defines work? Who defines rest? What if work to one person is a rest to another? It doesn't What does it mean to make a day holy? Well, someone needed to decide all these things, but who decides? Well, a couple of weeks ago I needed to be in hospital for a small operation. Thanks for your prayers, and I'm sure you're glad to hear they did find my heart. Anyhow, after coming back from the theatre, I was a bit bored, so I started answering my emails and texts. I got my whole office on my phone, for which I was then told off. I was told off not by the nurses, not by the doctors, but by Dan and Amy and Emma and a few others. And in so many words they were asking, what do you think you're playing at? Why don't you rest, was the common message. Well, I hadn't given it a thought. For me, what I was doing was most certainly not work. Now, the Jews needed someone to tell them what work was and what rest was. On the Jewish Sabbath they were not permitted to work. But who defined work? Well, it was the rabbis. And what made it more complicated was that different rabbis had different rules, and a rabbi's interpretation on how to live the Torah was spoken of as the rabbi's yoke. And you followed a certain rabbi because you believed that that particular rabbi's set of interpretations was the closest to what God intended through the scriptures. And when you followed that rabbi, you were said to be taking that rabbi's yoke. Now, in addition to the 613 commands in the Jewish law, the rabbis added their own interpretations of how each of these laws was to be lived out in almost every conceivable life situation, and it became unbearable. And some rabbis' yokes were much more unbearable than others. In effect, the religious leaders made people slaves to the Jewish law. And Jesus said of these rabbis, they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Again, keeping a text within its context, we notice that immediately following Jesus' words about his yoke being easy and his burden being light, Matthew tells us two instances when Jesus got into trouble. Firstly, because the Pharisees saw Jesus' disciples pick up some corn and eat it on the Sabbath. As incredible as it sounds, some rabbis believed that this actually constituted work, as the disciples, they believed, were harvesting grain, and they were therefore breaking the Sabbath law. Shortly afterwards, Matthew tells us, still on the Sabbath day, that Jesus healed a man with a withered hand. But instead of these religious people praising God for the amazing miracle, the Pharisees went out and plotted how they might kill Jesus, believing that he had broken the Sabbath laws. Can you imagine living in that way, under those kinds of rules? It was unbearable. Now, in contrast, Jesus invites all who were weary and burdened by these numerous petty rules imposed upon them to instead come to him, and he would give them rest for their souls. For he says his yoke is easy. Now, the Greek word for easy is the word krestos, which means well-fitting. And Jesus says, my yoke is well-fitting. The wooden yoke placed on an ox needed to be carefully adjusted in order to fit well. Otherwise it would cut into the animal. It was tailor-made. And Jesus is saying that his ways and his teaching and his principles for living, his values for life, are not burdensome. They fit well. Jesus is encouraging us that being his follower is not a matter of trying to keep some tedious set of rules and regulations, nigh on impossible to keep, nor is it some wearisome drudgery. Rather, Jesus is promising us that if we come to him and walk in his ways, then we will know freedom and joy and rest for our soul. The Jews had a lovely word for this. It was the word shalom, the peace of God, a deep-seated sense of well-being. It is well with my soul. Now, Jesus is not some harsh taskmaster He is not some slave driver putting us under the divine thumb, cramping our freedom, or just waiting for us to slip up. He says, I am gentle and humble in heart. Well, in which ways do we see Jesus' gentleness shine through in the Gospels? There are so many examples. Later in Matthew chapter 12, Matthew quotes the prophet Isaiah and provides us with one of the loveliest phrases found in all the scriptures about the gentleness of Jesus. Matthew quotes the prophet Isaiah, who prophesied how the Messiah would treat people. And this is what he says: a bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. Now, Isaiah, in his expressive word pictures and poetic prophecy, describes hurting people as bruised reeds and smouldering wicks. Jesus encountered many bruised reeds and many smouldering wicks. A few moments ago we read of the man with a shriveled hand. Jesus gave this man not only his health, but his ability to make a living and to support his family, as well as self-respect. Others walked by him, and maybe they even despised his disability. We know that many Jews wrongly believed that such disability was the result of sin. Remember the time when the disciples asked Jesus about the man born blind? They asked, who sinned? Was it this man or was it his parents? Now this bruised reed was treated with gentleness and kindness, bringing restoration. Then there was the woman who was caught in an act of adultery in John chapter 8. Jesus was asked by the religious leaders what they should do with her. They stated that the law instructed that such women should be stoned to death. But what did Jesus think? Well, it was obviously a trap. If Jesus had answered, stone her, then he would have been denying who he was, his true character. If he said, let her go free, then he would have been accused as being someone who taught against the law of Moses. What Jesus did was he bent down and wrote in the dirt. What he wrote is not known to us. But then he looked up and answered, if any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her. What an amazing answer that was. And we are told that they left one by one, the older ones first, until it was only Jesus and the woman who were left. He then said to her, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. Then neither do I condemn you. Go and leave your life of sin. That's what true gentleness looks like. It treats the other person as someone of value, as someone to be loved, not a problem to be solved, as Dan said in an excellent sermon recently. Then we have the story of Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19. He was a man hated by his own countrymen, not just because he was collecting taxes on behalf of the Roman authorities, the enemy, from his own people, but because he probably lined his own pockets with some extra taxes. He was regarded as a traitor. Well, Jesus called him by name and said that he was coming to his home for tea. Jesus' gentle approach towards someone so despised helped bring him to a place of redemption. He responded to Jesus' gentleness in a way that he might not have responded to harsh words or from a wagging finger. Luke tells us about the thief who was crucified next to Jesus. And despite all that Jesus experienced, the torture, the scourging that he received, the nails, the crown of thorns, the ridicule, the insults, he still responded with gentleness to the man next to him, who requested to be remembered when Jesus entered his kingdom. Today you will be with me in paradise, said Jesus. What about Peter, brash, boasting Peter, who said he was prepared to die for Jesus, and then denied Jesus 3 times? Peter was later restored through the gentleness of that conversation with Jesus on the beach, John chapter 21. Proverbs 15 verse 1 tells us that a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. 3 times he denied Jesus, and in that conversation on the beach, Jesus gave him the opportunity to confess his love for Jesus 3 times. Beautiful moment demonstrating again the gentleness of Jesus. And there was that woman who had been hemorrhaging for 18 long years. It was a condition that caused her to be socially isolated and desperate. A bruised reed, if there ever was one. Did Jesus scold her for breaking all the laws on ritual cleanliness? Did he admonish her for touching him and making him unclean too? No. He called her daughter. Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. And what about the widow from the town of Nain, whose only son had just died? Not only grieving her son, but her means of financial support in old age was lost. What about the despised sufferers of leprosy, who were banned from any social contact? These disfigured, isolated, desperate men and women who society had shunned. More bruised reeds. Let's not forget that woman who came to Jesus when he was having dinner in the home of Simon the Pharisee, who made a right spectacle of herself. She poured her perfume out on Jesus and washed his feet with her tears and dried his feet with her hair. And Simon knew what sort of woman she was and despised her. But Jesus loved her and told her that she had been forgiven much because she loved much. Over and over and over again in the Gospels, we see Jesus caring for bruised reeds of this world. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out. Jesus understands the bruised reed because he was bruised for our iniquities. That is, he was bruised on behalf of people like us who are bruised by sin. He came to heal and bind up the brokenhearted. You see, I think that gentleness has fallen on hard times. These days there seems to be a lot of focus on being strong and assertive, from self-help courses to TED Talks. But Paul tells us that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, Paul goes a step further and instructs Timothy to pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. To the Ephesians, Paul encourages them to live a life worthy of the calling that you have received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. To the church at Philippi, in Philippians chapter 1 verse 5, he reminds us to let your gentleness be evident to all. Now Peter, who himself had been a recipient of Christ's gentleness, writes, and if someone asks you about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it. But do this in a gentle and respectful way. In other words, don't Bible bash people into submission. Don't always aim at winning the argument. Look towards winning the person. Be gentle and respectful of other people's views. You might be wrong. Listen to what they have to say. Be winsome. Now, I know that's not a word you often hear much today, winsome, which means being attractive and engaging in our personality and in our conversation. Basically, by being winsome, we win some. We live in a broken world with broken and bruised people all around us. Those people need to be loved and shown compassion and treated with kindness and respect, because they too have been created in the image of God. Got a question for you. Who could benefit by a little more gentleness from you or from me this week? Maybe some kind words, a card, some other gesture of love. I don't know about you, but I'm most certainly a work in progress. I sometimes get this right and I sometimes get it wrong. Sometimes I get it very wrong and on occasions might need to apologize. But I do know that I get it right far more often than I used to. I'm on a journey, probably just like you. Another question. Who are those bruised reeds and smouldering wicks in society today? That's a big question that might require some thought. Who are those isolated and marginalised, those hurting and wounded by what life has thrown at them? Take some time to think about that, won't you? So let me come into land and tell you of a dark, damp November evening on the outskirts of the city of Cardiff some 33 years ago. Our fledgling church, only 6 weeks old, had just completed a midweek service at the primary school hall. Chairs were being stacked and the caretaker waiting impatiently to lock up that building for the night. He made some very derogatory remarks about some of the people that we had in our church at the time. People with learning disabilities and those who were on the margins of society. Though the caretaker didn't phrase his observations quite as politely as I did. "Your church seems to attract them," he said sneeringly. He was not only disparaging to the people, but also belittling the work of our new church, the work that we were attempting to undertake on this new socially deprived housing estate. I responded by saying, "Society turns such people away. Their reaction is just like yours. But the reason that we gather people that you call odd is that they know that in our church they will find love and acceptance. The world at large might pile them on the garbage heap, but we don't. They're precious to us because they're precious to God." Now this guy, he was a tough guy, and yet he walked away with tears in his eyes. I have no idea why that remark touched something quite deeply within him, or what God was beginning to do in his heart at the time. But it was one of those occasions when I sensed God providing me with an answer that was well beyond my own wisdom. There's an interesting exchange of letters between 2nd century Greek historian Celsus, an opponent of Christianity, and a church leader named Origen. Celsus wrote, "When most teachers go forth and teach, they cry, 'Come to me, all you who are clean and worthy,' and they are followed by the highest caliber of people available. But your silly master cries, 'Come to me, all who are down and beaten by life,' and so accumulates around him the ragtag and bobtail of humanity." Origen replied, "Yes, they are the ragtag and bobtail of humanity, but Jesus does not leave them that way. Out of the material that you would have thrown away as useless, he fashions men, giving them back their self-respect, enabling them to stand on their feet and look God in the eyes. They were cowed, cringing, broken things, but the Son has set them free." And I thank Father God that he has a passion for the lost, the least and the lonely. It is a passion which impassions me. I thank God for Jesus, for the one who is gentle and humble in heart, who reached out to me, not with harsh words or a wagging finger or a stick, but with unconditional love, which we call grace. I thank God for his Spirit, who enables me to live a life and calling and purpose, and empowers me to love others with a love that I have freely received, a love which continues to astound me. This is the way of Jesus. God bless you. Have a great week.